Hi, this is Dr. Goldkamp, and welcome back to the Keto Naturopath. I want to line up what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go into the second segment of the interview I did with Dr. Gaby. And today we're going to talk about vitamin D. Everybody's heard about vitamin D, and it's wonderful. Well, what you probably have not heard about vitamin D are things you should not do with vitamin D because it can create a lot of damage and a lot of injury. So we're going to go into that. So you will know how to use vitamin D safely at a reasonable dose, when to use it, maybe you won't have to take it at all. So it's an important topic to cover. In addition to that, we're going to go into glaucoma, we're going to go into vitamin B3, we'll go into the use of certain minerals, we'll also go into methylated B vitamins. Methylated B vitamins, are they necessary? It's, if you're aware enough to know that, oh gosh, methylated, it's the thing to do. Well, maybe it's one of those things that actually has little to no substantiate good research. Wouldn't you like to know that? Wouldn't you like to know that it's mostly marketing hype? Well, that's where we're going to go to find out if we can tell you if it's hype or if it's useful. Please listen. I think it's very important, and it's probably one of the biggest issues out there that is so over-advertised that time to pull back and find out what we know. Dr. Gaby is the definitive source of what we know about that until some new research comes along, okay? Stay tuned for that. And that will be it for today. Talk to you later. Bye-bye. Vitamin D is obviously something I measure, and then, you find high and low, and then you certainly put it into the protocol, but I'm not quite sure if that's sufficient enough. And sometimes I wonder if it's, I induce hypercalcemia by encouraging people to go more. So let me know what you think.
Yeah, so this is one of the few areas where I agree with the conventional medical community about how to use a vitamin. I've always been of the school that very large doses are sometimes more effective than typical nutritional doses. For example, in the treatment of schizophrenia, if you use like 3 grams a day of vitamin B3 and 3 grams a day of vitamin C, according to the work of Abram Hoffer, a lot of schizophrenic patients have gotten well. I told you about the massive doses of vitamin C for infections. We use high doses of vitamin B6 for carpal tunnel syndrome, and the list goes on and on. With vitamin D, however, I disagree with a lot of what's being done in the so-called alternative or natural medicine community, where people are measuring the blood level and they're pushing the level with massive doses to bring it to what they claim is an optimal blood level of vitamin D. And I've written about this and analyzed it and studied it. And there are a couple of conclusions that I've come to. Number one, the blood test is extremely unreliable as a measure of vitamin D. Number two, they changed all the reference ranges. So to the extent that the result is reliable, which it really isn't, the numbers are very different than what they used to be. For example, a number of 15 used to be considered deficient. Now they say 30. And almost everybody, well, not almost everybody, but probably 50% of the population comes out deficient based on these numbers. Number three, there is a large and growing body of evidence that high-dose vitamin D not only is unsafe in that it can cause kidney stones with the hypercalciuria, increased urinary calcium that you get. There's studies in animals that it might cause atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries. And there's also evidence that high doses are less effective than moderate doses. One study came out in the AMA journal 2 years ago. They looked at a bunch of Canadian adults, and they gave them either 400 units, which is not an optimal level. I think the evidence shows that 800 to 1200 is optimal for bone density. But they compared 400 with 4,000 and with 10,000 units a day of vitamin D for 3 years. And the bone loss was measured at the radius, which is in the arm, and they measured it in the tibia, which is in the leg. And with increasing doses, there was greater bone loss. 4,000 was worse than 400. 10,000 was worse than 4,000, and it was statistically significant. And this was clear evidence that high-dose vitamin D accelerates bone loss in the average healthy person. There's also research with multiple sclerosis, where they gave an average of about 13,000 units a day, or 1,000 units a day. And the ones who got the higher dose had greater disease activity and more disease flare-ups than the one that got the moderate dose. And there's also evidence in people with chronic lung disease, COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Higher doses seem to lead to more flare-ups than moderate doses. And if you're severely deficient, then it helps. But if you're not severely deficient, it either doesn't help or maybe produces a slight adverse effect. So one of the things we have to be aware of is vitamin D is very different from all of the other vitamins. In evolution, it is not a vitamin. There was not any vitamin D in the human diet, unless maybe you stole some pterodactyl eggs or lived near the sea and got some fish. The main source of vitamin D in the human diet is milk fortified with vitamin D, artificially fortified. And there's some in eggs and there's some in fish. But for people who don't eat that, they get very, very little in their diet. So vitamin D is part of what I like to call the sunlight complex. You know, you hear of the B complex vitamins. I call it the sunlight complex because when the human skin is exposed to sunlight, it produces vitamin D. It also produces a chemical known as corticotropin releasing hormone, which those of you who have studied biochemistry know it is a hormone produced in the brain, but lo and behold, it's also produced in the skin. It has multiple effects in the body related to immune function, cardiovascular health, gastrointestinal health, and other things. Also, the ultraviolet light from the sun goes into the eye through the retina, and it goes to the brain, the pineal gland, and it stimulates the hypothalamus and then the so-called pituitary adrenal thyroid axis. And it stimulates a lot of different hormonal functions in the body. So humans evolved with sunlight, not with the presence of vitamin D. And if you only take vitamin D, as opposed to getting sunlight, you're not getting all these other factors. In addition, when you're continually exposed to sunlight, the skin manufactures vitamin D, and then it breaks down the vitamin D into another molecule that actually moderates the effect of the vitamin D. It binds the breakdown product that is produced in sunlight binds to the same receptors that activated vitamin D binds to. So here, if you live naturally, and I'm not saying go out and get skin cancer by being out all day, but if you have a mild to moderate amount of sunlight exposure, you're not only getting vitamin D, you're getting breakdown products that modulate the effect of vitamin D, and you're getting many other things. And if you just take vitamin D, you're not getting these other things. And I think the toxicity is greater and the effect is less. So what I tell people to do, don't measure your vitamin D if you're an average healthy person. If you have malabsorption from Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, or if you've got cancer, or if you never go outside, or if you're very elderly and can't manufacture vitamin D very well in your skin, sure, let's find out what your level is and maybe try to bring it up to normal. But there are so many errors that are apparent in measuring vitamin D that it may lead to inappropriate conclusions. So for the average healthy person who's not getting much sun, I say take 800 to 1,200 units a day of vitamin D and don't measure your level. Now, I know that's controversial, but that's what I do. And I've told this to many, many practitioners, and some of them are quite upset with what I tell them. Others say, oh, thank you for doing that. I had this deep-seated fear that what we were doing with these high doses of vitamin D are wrong. So thank you for presenting the evidence that that's not the right thing to do.
Absolutely, Alan. You know, it is not uncommon. If I was to call 10 naturopaths colleagues, I can bet that their minimum dose is 5K, you know, and some are 10K for a couple of weeks and then dropping it down. That's a big deal, and people don't quite hear that. The other question that comes up, and I mean, I answered it my way, but they go, all right, so what about Eskimos? Why aren't they all sick? You know, so what do we say? Is the sun not strong enough? We hear about, was it 37 degrees, you know, and you're in New Hampshire and I'm a New Hampshire boy, and we have you had long winters. Do you then say, I'm going to go outside, vitamin D seasonal, I'm going to take my vitamin D? What's your winter aspect of that? Because people obviously thrive before vitamin D was a supplement in the North. And What's your two takes?
Yeah, well, I generally supplement with moderate amounts in the winter because, yeah, you're right. You don't get, excuse me, because you don't get much sunlight then. So maybe 1,000 units a day during the winter, I think is a good idea. Some people higher, but most people, that's fine. As far as how people who evolved in the North deal with low vitamin D, it's interesting that, Scandinavians have very fair skin. And African Americans, blacks that live in Africa, obviously have darker skin, and their ability to synthesize vitamin D is reduced. But also, there are genetic differences. Blacks have a difference in what is called the vitamin D binding protein. They have lower concentrations of vitamin D binding protein, so a higher percentage of the vitamin D that's in their body is free as opposed to being bound to this protein. So that means for whatever amount they have in their body, more of it is active. So there have been, and we don't know a whole lot about it, but there have apparently been evolutionary changes so that people who evolved in a certain area related to the amount of sunlight have evolved in a way to deal with that. And that's probably why when certain ethnic groups move to Europe, they end up with serious vitamin D problems because they were not genetically set up to live in that area. South Asians, for example, end up with severe vitamin D deficiency when they move to the United Kingdom. So, it's a genetic issue. And I think those who have migrated, we should, measure their levels and deal with them as individuals. But otherwise, I think the body does remarkably good at handling differences.
Yep. Thank you for that. That's a great explanation. Let's migrate into the nasty complex of B vitamins. But
nasty?
Yeah. Let's start with let's do glaucoma and B3 first, then we'll get into methylated vitamins and wherever we want to go from there. So tell me about B3 and glaucoma.
Yeah, well, glaucoma is a condition where the peripheral vision gradually shrinks in and you can't see wide vision, and it's because of damage to the optic nerve. And the best known and most obvious risk factor is when the eye pressure, known as the intraocular pressure, goes up. And that it's kind of like having high blood pressure, but here it's high intraocular pressure, and that continued pressure damages the optic nerve. However, there are people who have what they call normal tension glaucoma, which means their intraocular pressure is not elevated, and yet their optic nerve gets damaged too. So what's going on there? And there are some people with high intraocular pressure who get glaucoma and others who don't. So you have to look at what other factors are involved. And what animal research has shown is that the functioning of the mitochondria inside the optic cells starts to become impaired before there is any evidence of actual glaucoma. And this impairment seems to be related to a deficiency of those nutrients that are involved in energy production. Niacinamide or vitamin B3 is one of those. There are others. There's coenzyme Q10, there's magnesium, and there's iron if you're deficient in iron. But they looked at an animal model of glaucoma where mice genetically, they all get glaucoma. They have elevated intraocular pressure and they all get glaucoma 100% of the time. And they gave them niacinamide and it prevented the development of glaucoma. We also know that blood levels of niacinamide are lower in people with glaucoma than in those who don't have it. So this is early evidence, but it stands to reason that if there's an age-related decline in mitochondrial function, which there is in glaucoma, in people who have glaucoma, there's an age-related decline in the mitochondrial function of the cells of the retina. And niacinamide and those other nutrients that I mentioned have the potential to reverse that. And as I said, we know that blood levels of vitamin B3 are low in people with glaucoma, and we know from the animal studies that it can prevent the development. So based on the fact that we have used niacinamide for other conditions, we've used it for osteoarthritis, we've used it for insomnia, we've used it for anxiety, and as I mentioned before, for schizophrenia, it seems reasonable to supplement with it. Now, a safe level for most people, 50 to 100 milligrams, nobody's going to be concerned about that. If you're getting in the gram dosages, you need to have that followed by a practitioner, because you want to do some blood tests to make sure that it's not damaging your liver. If it's very high doses, it can do that. But even a moderate nutritional dose has the potential to either prevent or slow the progression of glaucoma. Very exciting. We'd like to see a nice controlled study come out, which is pending as far as I'm told.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're not talking about age-related macular degeneration, but since we're in the eye, is there any association between those two? Usually we hear about carotenoids and so on and so forth for the age-related macular degeneration. Do you see any crossover or anything?
I have not seen any, and I think they're two separate conditions. Like you said, lutein, zeaxanthin, also maybe vitamin E might help. There's evidence that bilberry, which is a supplement, it's got the same molecules as the blueberry that we eat. That's available as a supplement. There's some evidence that ginkgo biloba, which is an herb, might help slow the progression. So there are a whole lot of different things that have been used. And of course, zinc. Zinc is crucial for macular degeneration. One of my pet peeves is some of these commercial products out there that are made by the drug companies that are said to be useful for macular degeneration. They have zinc in the form of zinc oxide, which is very poorly absorbed. And we know that when you take a lot of zinc, you have to take a little bit of copper, because excess zinc can deplete copper and can cause a whole host of problems due to copper deficiency. So they do put copper in their supplements, but it's in the form of cupric oxide. And there was a study published about 15 years ago, and I quote it: "The absorption of cupric oxide by humans is, quote, not significantly different from zero." That's the way they said it. What that means is you can't absorb cupric oxide. So here they're giving you copper to balance zinc, and it's in a form that's not absorbable. And then they give you zinc in a poorly absorbed form. So there are a lot of well-designed products made in the health food industry, as opposed to the drug industry, that use zinc in better absorbed forms, like zinc picolinate or zinc citrate or zinc aspartate. Copper or anything but cupric oxide is fine. So, I don't know why these drug companies do this, and it's fairly widely known. So they're obviously not getting good consultants.
Yep. No, yeah, obviously not. Let's migrate into more of the B complex in terms of methylated vitamins. Part of, I don't know when this started. It certainly had to do with the MTHFR gene, and the idea that, well, you can just hop around that problem with methylating it, because that's what that's supposed to do. And then it went to everything. Everything has to be methylated. And I'd love to hear what you have to say on that. I think it's gone too far. I'm not going to spend the time to track it down. I think you have.
Yeah, I've done my best. There's not as much research as we'd like. Anecdotally, we see that the activated form, this is actually not even methylated, but it's the activated form of vitamin B6, known as pyridoxal phosphate. So it's phosphorylated as opposed to methylated. But anecdotally, some people with carpal tunnel syndrome who do not benefit from pyridoxine, which is the widely used form of vitamin B6, if you switch them to pyridoxal phosphate, they do better. There's not published information on that. There is some published information on a certain type of epilepsy that happens in very young children. And when they gave them pyridoxal phosphate, they did better in some cases, not all, than when they got pyridoxine. Excuse me. Other than that, there's not any research I've seen on the activated form of B6 being better than pyridoxine. As far as methylated folate, that has been used to treat depression. It's actually approved as a prescription drug. But I think the evidence has been misrepresented or misunderstood because people who have the genetic polymorphism that you mentioned, the MTHFR, they clearly have a higher than normal requirement for folic acid. But the claim is made that they cannot convert folic acid to its active methylated form, and therefore you have to give the methylated form. But let's look at the research that's been done to investigate that. One of the things that folic acid is used for is to lower homocysteine levels. Homocysteine is a breakdown product of the amino acid methionine. and it appears to be quite toxic in the body. It can trigger a whole host of different problems, and elevated homocysteine levels is a risk factor for dementia, cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, and various other things. So you don't want to have high homocysteine levels. And one would think that if you had the genetic abnormality, the MTHFR abnormality, that you would have to take the methylated folate. In fact, when they compared, they found that in people that had this abnormality, folic acid actually lowered homocysteine levels more effectively than the methylated form did. So theoretically, from what we can extrapolate from biochemistry, we would have assumed the opposite. But as it turns out, folic acid is more effective for people who have that genetic abnormality. In addition, although no direct comparisons have been done, we know that the methylated form of folic acid, of methylfolate, is effective as a treatment for depression when you give it in combination with something like Prozac. It improves the effect of Prozac, but only when you give it at 15 milligrams a day. It does not work when you give it at half that dose, at 7.5 milligrams a day. In contrast, when you use folic acid as an adjunct to Prozac, it's effective at ranges of 0.5 to 5 milligrams a day. Right. So it appears that folic acid is more potent as an adjunct to antidepressants than methylfolate is. So a lot of times we make extrapolations based on what we think should be from basic science, biochemistry, and it turns out to be the opposite. As far as methylated vitamin B12, there are studies showing that methylcobalamin, which is methylated B12, is effective for the treatment of some conditions, but I have not seen any comparative studies to compare it with something, for example, like hydroxycobalamin, which is the kind that I use. So at this point, and riboflavin, well, that's actually phosphorylated too, riboflavin 5-phosphate, not methylated. So at this point, I would agree with your initial conclusion that most of this is hyped, and we actually don't even know whether it's less effective in some cases. We do know that taking an extrapolation from vitamin B12, when you put vitamin B12 in a multi with thiamine and vitamin C and copper, it damages the vitamin B12. It breaks it down and converts it into other things. And we know that methylfolate is relatively unstable compared with folic acid. So if you put methylfolate in a multivitamin with a dozen other chemicals, we don't know if there's going to be some oxidation damage, whether it's going to break it down. So that's the other reason. While I do use methylfolate occasionally, I'm concerned about putting it in a multivitamin with a whole lot of other things.
Good point. Good point. A bit of a tangent here. On this, when I was in med school back in those days, MTHFR was just starting to come out, and you had to order it. Then in practice, you had to order as an individual test, to Quest or whoever your lab was. And I don't know when I discovered it. So I'm homozygous, and my wife is homozygous. And relative to homocysteine, she's less a believer in supplementation as I am, be that as it may. And so I said, just go check your homocysteine. Let's go down and get a take. And hers was really high. I won't even give you a number. It was really the highest I've ever seen. However, she also did it at a time in which we generally don't have dairy. And she had a dairy splurge because she does it for her birthday and so on. Do you have any association that you know of homocysteine and dairy? I know this is kind of like left and right, a bit too far of a stretch.
Was it a fasting level, or did she take it right after?
It was fasting level. No, fasting level.
Fasting level.
Well, wasn't that something? I mean, you probably did not know that about methylated vitamins. You probably thought they were all the rage. And of course you should take methylated vitamins because they're better. Better how? Better to get you in trouble, maybe. And that's exactly what I see in my practice. We have a program that we bring people through, and guess what? At least half the people that come through the program, when you go through their labs, you point out that they're overdosing in vitamins. Vitamins have become the new drugs with their own new set of side effects. So you got to be appropriate, and you got to know what you're doing. It doesn't mean you have to be a scientist, far from it, but you need to have a little basic understanding of why you're taking this. Okay, so I hope you got a lot out of this. I got a lot out of it, and I certainly defer to anything Dr. Gaby says on the subject. Also, you learned about vitamin D. Pretty impressive. There's more to come. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.